The barn was already half consumed by flames when Yates Hartwell kicked open the doors and plunged into the inferno to save the horses screaming inside. The year was 1898, and Nome, Alaska had been nothing but a collection of hastily constructed buildings and tents until gold had been discovered along the beaches just months before. Now thousands of prospectors flooded the remote coastal town, and with them came the need for horses, supplies, and people willing to risk everything for a chance at fortune. Yates had come north not for gold, but to escape a past that haunted him in the lower states, finding work as a stable hand for one of the few established merchants in town. The fire had started from a knocked-over lantern, or so someone would later claim. But in that moment, all that mattered was getting the animals out before the whole structure collapsed. He managed to lead 3 horses through the smoke and heat before going back for the last 2. The smoke was so thick by then that he could barely see his hand in front of his face. His lungs burned with every breath, and he could feel the searing heat blistering his skin. He found the horses terrified and kicking in their stalls, and somehow got them moving toward where he remembered the door being. The beam fell just as he stumbled out into the cool Alaskan night air, missing him by inches but sending up a shower of sparks and embers that seemed to fill the entire sky. He collapsed onto the muddy ground, coughing violently, his throat feeling like someone had scraped it raw with broken glass. People gathered around him, their voices distant and muffled. Someone poured water over his face and chest. He tried to speak, to ask if all the horses had made it, but nothing came out except a strangled, painful rasp that didn't sound human. He tried again, forcing air through his damaged throat, but only managed a whisper that dissolved into another coughing fit. The town's doctor, an older man named Perkins who had seen his share of mining accidents and frostbite cases, knelt beside him and shook his head gravely. "Don't try to talk, son," Dr. Perkins said, his weathered face lined with concern. "You have breathed in too much smoke. Your throat and voice box are badly damaged. You need complete rest." Yates spent the next 3 days in a small room above the general store, his employer having taken pity on him despite the loss of the barn. He lay on a narrow cot, staring at the rough wooden ceiling, trying every few hours to make a sound. Each attempt resulted in either nothing or a painful, useless croak that made his eyes water. Dr. Perkins visited daily, examining his throat and shaking his head with increasing worry. "I will be honest with you, Yates," the doctor finally said on the 4th day. "The damage is extensive. Your vocal cords may heal somewhat with time, but I have seen injuries like this before. You may never speak properly again. I am sorry." The words hit him harder than the falling beam had. Yates was 24 years old, strong and capable, but the idea of going through life unable to speak filled him with a despair he hadn't felt even when fleeing his past. He had already been a man of few words, but to have no words at all seemed like a prison sentence. How would he work? How would he communicate? How would he live any kind of normal life in this harsh frontier town where a man's voice could mean the difference between getting help and dying alone in the snow? Dr. Perkins provided him with a small notebook and a pencil. "Write what you need to say," he instructed. "It is not perfect, but it will help." Yates nodded, his jaw tight. He had decent handwriting, learned from a mother who had insisted education mattered even on a small farm in Missouri, but writing felt slow and clumsy compared to speaking. Still, he had no choice. He wrote his first message in the notebook. "Thank you for your help." The doctor patted his shoulder. "You saved 5 horses, son. That took courage. Don't lose that courage now." By the end of the week, Yates was back on his feet, though his throat still ached, and attempts to speak resulted in nothing more than a harsh whisper that hurt too much to maintain. His employer, a portly man named Stevens, had already begun rebuilding the barn with the help of hired laborers. He approached Yates one morning as the young man stood watching the construction. "I cannot pay you for work you cannot do," Stevens said bluntly. "You are a good stable hand, Hartwell, but I need someone who can call out orders and handle customers. I am sorry, but I have to let you go." Yates had expected as much. He nodded and didn't bother reaching for his notebook. What was there to say? He collected his few belongings and walked out into the muddy streets of Nome, wondering what he would do next. The town was chaos, with fortune seekers arriving daily by ship during the brief summer months when the Bering Sea wasn't frozen solid. There were opportunities here, supposedly, but most required either skills he didn't have or a voice he no longer possessed. He found work where he could, mostly hauling supplies and doing manual labor that required no communication beyond following pointed fingers and nodded instructions. The pay was minimal, barely enough for a shared tent and meals of beans and hardtack. The notebook went largely unused because most people in Nome were too busy chasing gold to care about a mute laborer's written words. He became increasingly isolated, a silent figure moving through the crowded, noisy town like a ghost. It was nearly 3 weeks after the fire when he first saw her. Yates had been hired to help unload a ship that had just arrived from Seattle, one of the last vessels before winter would lock the coast in ice. He was carrying a heavy crate down the gangplank when he noticed a young woman standing on the dock looking around with an expression that mixed determination and uncertainty. She wore a practical gray dress and a warm coat, her dark blonde hair pinned up beneath a simple hat. She carried 2 large bags and kept glancing at a piece of paper in her hand, as if checking an address. What struck him immediately was not her appearance, though she was certainly pretty, but the way she seemed to really see things. Most people in Nome looked through each other, focused only on their own prospects and survival. This woman looked at everything carefully, taking in details, watching faces. When her eyes passed over him, he felt the strangest sensation, as if she had actually registered his existence rather than just seeing another laborer. He looked away quickly, hoisting the crate and carrying it to the warehouse. When he returned for another load, she was still there, and now she appeared frustrated. An older man in a suit was talking to her, shaking his head. Even from a distance, Yates could read the disappointment on her face. "I am sorry, miss," the man was saying as Yates walked past. "Your brother sent word that he had lodging arranged for you, but the place burned down 2 weeks ago. There is nothing available right now unless you want to share a tent with 15 miners." "That is not acceptable," the young woman said firmly. Her voice was clear and had a slight accent that Yates couldn't quite place, something educated and Eastern. "There must be somewhere, a boarding house, a hotel." "The hotel has been full for months," the man replied. "This is Nome, not Boston. We are barely civilized here." Yates should have kept walking, but something made him pause. The woman looked like she was trying very hard not to panic, her hands gripping her bags tightly. She had come all this way to find her brother, apparently, and now had nowhere to stay. He knew that feeling, the sensation of being adrift with no solid ground beneath you. Before he could think better of it, he approached them. The man in the suit looked at him with annoyance. "We don't need any help here. Move along." But the woman looked at Yates with those careful, observant eyes. Up close, he could see they were a striking shade of gray-blue, like the ocean before a storm. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. He pulled out his notebook and wrote quickly, "I know someone who rents rooms, clean and safe." He showed the message to them. The man scoffed. "You know how many liars and thieves there are in this town, miss? You cannot trust just anyone." But the woman kept looking at Yates. She looked at his eyes, really looked, in a way that made him feel like she was reading something written there. It was the strangest feeling, being seen so completely by a stranger. "What is your name?" she asked him directly. He wrote, "Yates Hartwell." "I am Rosalie Lawson," she said. She paused, still holding his gaze. "You were telling the truth about the room." It wasn't a question. She had somehow decided just from looking at him that he was trustworthy. The man in the suit sputtered a protest, but Rosalie ignored him. "Can you take me there now?" she asked Yates. He nodded. He wrote, "I need to finish this load. 10 minutes." "I will wait," Rosalie said simply. The man in the suit gave up and walked away, muttering about foolish Eastern women. Yates returned to his work, hyper-aware now of Rosalie standing on the dock, watching the activity around her. He finished unloading the crates as quickly as he could, collected his few coins in payment, and returned to where she waited. She smiled when she saw him, a small but genuine expression. "Thank you for helping me, Mr. Hartwell." He gestured for her to follow and picked up one of her bags despite her protest. The room he had in mind was owned by a widow named Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had come to Nome with her husband before he died in a mining accident. She ran a laundry service and rented out 2 small rooms in her surprisingly sturdy house on the edge of town. One of the rooms had just become available, Yates knew, because the previous tenant had finally struck enough gold to move into better accommodations. As they walked through the muddy, crowded streets, Yates was conscious of Rosalie beside him, taking in the rough town with its mixture of log buildings, canvas tents, and false-fronted shops. Nome was not beautiful, especially now in late August with the autumn rains beginning, but Rosalie didn't seem frightened or disgusted, just observant. "How did you lose your voice?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. He stopped walking and pulled out his notebook. He had written the explanation so many times in the past weeks that he could almost do it from memory. Barn fire, saved horses, smoke damaged my throat. Rosalie read the words and looked up at him. That was very brave. He shrugged uncomfortably and started walking again. Brave seemed like the wrong word when he had been left unable to speak, unable to work properly, unable to do much of anything. "When did it happen?" Rosalie asked, keeping pace with him. He held up 3 fingers, then made a writing motion. 3 weeks ago, she guessed. He nodded. "The doctor said you won't recover your voice?" He shook his head. They walked in silence for another minute. Then Rosalie said quietly, "I think there are many ways to communicate. Words are just one of them." He glanced at her, surprised. She was looking straight ahead, but there was something thoughtful in her expression, as if she was working through a problem. They reached Mrs. Chen's house, a small but well-built structure with real glass windows, a rarity in Nome. Yates knocked on the door, and Mrs. Chen answered, her weathered face breaking into a smile when she saw him. "Yates?" she said warmly. She was one of the few people who didn't treat him differently after he lost his voice. "What can I do for you?" He gestured to Rosalie and wrote quickly in his notebook, "This is Miss Lawson. She needs the room." Mrs. Chen's eyes brightened. "The room is available. Come in, come in." The interior of the house was clean and surprisingly comfortable. Mrs. Chen showed Rosalie the small room, which contained a real bed with a proper mattress, a washstand, a small stove, and a window that looked out toward the Bering Sea. By Nome standards, it was luxurious. "How much is the rent?" Rosalie asked. Mrs. Chen named a price that was steep but fair for Nome. Rosalie didn't hesitate. "I will take it. Thank you." As Mrs. Chen and Rosalie discussed details, Yates set down the bag he had been carrying and prepared to leave. His good deed was done, but as he moved toward the door, Rosalie called out, "Mr. Hartwell, wait." He turned. She crossed the room to him, that same careful, observant look in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "truly. I know you didn't have to help me." He nodded, unsure what else to do. He reached for his notebook, then hesitated. What would he write? "You are welcome" seemed inadequate. But Rosalie tilted her head again, looking at his face. "You are wondering why I trusted you," she said. He froze. That was exactly what he had been thinking. She smiled slightly. "You have kind eyes. Sad, but kind. And when you wrote that, you knew a place your expression was earnest. People's faces tell you a lot if you pay attention." He stared at her. She had read all of that just from looking at him? "I have always been good at reading people," Rosalie continued. "My mother used to say I was too observant for my own good, but it is useful, especially in a place like this." He managed a small, hesitant smile. Then he wrote, "Why did you come to Nome?" "My brother Robert came here 6 months ago looking for gold," Rosalie explained. "He wrote that he had found work and a place to live. He wanted me to join him. I was teaching at a school in Seattle, but the opportunity for adventure was too tempting to resist." She paused. "Though I'm beginning to think my brother was overly optimistic about conditions here." Your brother's name? Yates wrote. Robert Lawson. Do you know him? Yates shook his head. In a town of thousands of transient prospectors, one name meant little. I will find him, Rosalie said confidently. Nome is not that large. Mrs. Chen returned with tea, and Rosalie insisted that Yates stay for a cup. He tried to refuse, but both women were insistent, and he found himself sitting at Mrs. Chen's small table holding a warm cup and listening to Rosalie talk about her journey from Seattle. She spoke easily, not seeming to mind that he could not respond verbally. When he wrote brief responses in his notebook, she read them carefully and replied as if they were having a normal conversation. It was the strangest and most comfortable interaction Yates had experienced since losing his voice. Most people either shouted at him as if he were deaf or ignored him entirely. Rosalie did neither. She simply adjusted, watching his face and his hands, picking up on gestures and expressions. You are not from Alaska originally, she said at one point. It was not a question. He wrote, Missouri, you? Massachusetts originally, Rosalie said, but I moved to Seattle 3 years ago. I wanted to see more of the country. My parents thought I was insane. She laughed, and it was a warm sound that made something in Yates's chest tighten. They were probably right. What brought you north? He hesitated. The notebook suddenly felt heavy in his hands. He could write something vague, something that wouldn't reveal too much. But those gray-blue eyes were watching him, and he had the strange sense that she would know if he lied. Needed a new start, he wrote simply. Rosalie nodded, and he saw understanding in her face. She didn't press for details. Nome seems like a good place for new starts. Everyone here is running from something or towards something. Which are you? He wrote. Toward, she said immediately, always toward. He envied that certainty. He had been running from for so long that he had forgotten what running toward might feel like. When he finally left Mrs. Chen's house, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the muddy streets. Yates walked back toward the tent he shared with 5 other laborers, his mind full of gray-blue eyes, and a woman who seemed to see straight through him. Over the following days, he found himself thinking about Rosalie more than he should. He had no business being interested in a woman like her. She was educated, articulate, obviously from a good family despite her adventurous streak. He was a voiceless laborer with a past he couldn't outrun and a future that looked increasingly bleak. But he couldn't stop remembering the way she had looked at him, really looked, and seen something worth helping. He didn't expect to see her again beyond perhaps passing on the street. Nome was busy enough that paths didn't have to cross. But 4 days after their first meeting, he was hauling lumber for a construction project when he heard someone call his name. Mr. Hartwell. He turned to see Rosalie hurrying toward him, picking her way carefully through the mud. She wore the same practical dress and coat, and her face was flushed from the cold wind that had picked up. I was hoping I would run into you, she said when she reached him. I wanted to thank you again. Mrs. Chen's house is wonderful, and she has been so kind. He set down the lumber he was carrying and pulled out his notebook. Did you find your brother? Her expression darkened. Yes, he is working a claim about 15 miles up the coast. I went to see him yesterday. She paused. He's doing well, but he apologized for the confusion about lodging. Apparently, he sent the letter about the boarding house months ago and didn't know it had burned. Communication here is rather unreliable. Will you stay? Yates wrote. For now, Rosalie said. I have already spoken to the schoolmaster, such as he is. There are enough children in Nome now that they need teachers. I start next week. He nodded, genuinely pleased for her. Then he wrote, Be careful. Nome can be dangerous. I know, she said seriously, but I can take care of myself, mostly. She smiled. Though having a friend here would be nice, would you consider yourself a friend, Mr. Hartwell? He stared at the question. A friend. When had he last had a friend? He had kept himself isolated for so long, first by choice and then by necessity. But Rosalie was looking at him with those perceptive eyes, and he found himself nodding before he could think better of it. Her smile widened. Wonderful. Then you must call me Rosalie, and may I call you Yates? He nodded again, feeling something warm uncurl in his chest. It was such a small thing, this offer of friendship, but it felt significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate. I am supposed to meet Mrs. Chen at the market in an hour, Rosalie said. She is teaching me which vendors are honest and which will cheat you if you do not pay attention. Would you like to join us? I promise we will not bore you with too much domestic talk. He should have said no. He had work to finish, and spending time with Rosalie felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with Nome's rough character, but he found himself writing, "I would like that." So began a friendship that surprised them both. Rosalie was new to Nome and needed guidance through the chaotic, often hostile environment. Yates needed someone who saw him as a person rather than a disability. They fell into an easy rhythm. Rosalie would find him during his lunch breaks or after his work was done, and they would walk through town together, or sit in Mrs. Chen's warm kitchen, or occasionally venture to the beach when the weather allowed. What amazed Yates most was how easily they communicated. At first, he relied heavily on his notebook, writing out his thoughts and responses, but Rosalie quickly became adept at reading him in other ways. She noticed when his eyes narrowed slightly in amusement or widened in surprise. She learned that he rubbed the back of his neck when he was frustrated and crossed his arms when he was uncomfortable. Within 2 weeks, they could have entire conversations with him writing only a handful of words. Rosalie somehow understanding what he was thinking just from watching his face. "You're thinking that the fish vendor is overcharging," she said one afternoon at the market, grinning at him. "I can see it in your expression." He pulled out his notebook to confirm, but she stopped him. "No, wait. Let me guess what you would say." She studied his face. "You think the fish vendor is overcharging and you know where we can get better prices. You want to take us there, but you're worried about offending Mrs. Chen's relationship with this vendor." She paused. "How did I do?" He stared at her, then slowly wrote, "Exactly right." Rosalie laughed, clearly delighted with herself. "I told you. Your eyes are very expressive, Yates. Once I learned how to read them, it became almost like you were speaking." It should have felt intrusive, being read so clearly, but instead it felt like relief. For the first time since the fire, Yates felt like he could truly communicate again, not perfectly and not like before, but in a way that worked. Rosalie made it work. The autumn days grew shorter and colder as September wore on. The last ships departed before the sea ice would close in, trapping Nome until the following spring. The town took on a more permanent feeling as people settled in for the long, dark winter. Yates managed to secure steadier work, helping to maintain the buildings and equipment that needed constant repair in the harsh climate. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than day labor, and it meant he could afford a small room of his own rather than the crowded tent. Rosalie started teaching at the small schoolhouse, a drafty log structure that served the children of miners, merchants, and native Inupiat families. She threw herself into the work with characteristic determination, often spending evenings preparing lessons by lamplight in Mrs. Chen's kitchen. Yates helped her carry supplies and repair broken desks, and in return she told him stories about her students, making him wish he could hear the voices she described. It was late September when things shifted between them. They had gone for a walk along the beach, bundled against the cold wind. The Bering Sea stretched gray and endless before them, waves crashing against the shore in a rhythm that needed no words. Rosalie had been quiet, unusual for her, and Yates kept glancing over to make sure she was all right. Finally, she stopped walking and turned to face him. "Can I ask you something personal?" He pulled out his notebook, already writing. "Yes?" "What happened in Missouri? What were you running from?" He had known the question would come eventually. Rosalie was too perceptive not to sense that he was hiding something. He stared at the notebook, trying to decide how much to reveal. The words came slowly, carefully. "My father," he wrote. "He was a violent man. Hurt my mother. Hurt me. I left when I was 17. He came after me. I had to keep moving." Rosalie read the words, her expression growing sad. "Is he still looking for you?" "I don't know," Yates wrote. "I hope he thinks I'm dead." "I am sorry," Rosalie said quietly. She reached out and touched his arm, a brief, gentle gesture. No one should have to live like that. He looked at her, and the compassion in her eyes made his throat tight with emotion that had nothing to do with smoke damage. He wanted to tell her more, to explain the years of fear and hiding, the constant weight of looking over his shoulder. But the words felt too big for his notebook. Rosalie seemed to understand anyway. "You are safe here," she said. "Nome is at the edge of the world. No one can find you here if you don't want to be found." He nodded, hoping she was right. Then, because he wanted to shift the focus away from himself, he wrote, "Why did you really come to Nome? Just for your brother?" She smiled slightly, as if she had been expecting that question too. "Partially, but also because I was tired of living a small, safe life. I wanted adventure. I wanted to see if I was brave enough to handle something difficult." She looked out at the ocean. "My parents always treated me like I was fragile because I was a woman. I wanted to prove I wasn't. Maybe that is foolish." "Not foolish," he wrote. "Brave." She looked at him, and something in her expression made his heart beat faster. "You think so?" He nodded firmly. Then, without thinking too hard about it, he wrote, "You are one of the bravest people I know." Rosalie's cheeks flushed, and not from the cold. "Thank you, Yates. That means a lot coming from you." They stood there for a moment, the wind whipping around them, the waves crashing, and something unspoken settling between them. Yates realized with a jolt that he was falling for her. It was a terrifying revelation. He had nothing to offer her, no voice, no prospects, no future beyond surviving day to day, but his heart apparently didn't care about practicalities. As if reading his thoughts, which she probably was from his expression, Rosalie said softly, "I am glad we met, Yates. You have made Nome feel less lonely." "Same," he managed to write, though the single word felt inadequate for everything he was feeling. They walked back to town in companionable silence, but everything felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. The weeks that followed were both wonderful and agonizing. Yates found excuses to see Rosalie as often as possible, and she seemed equally eager for his company. They established routines: morning coffee at Mrs. Chen's before Rosalie went to teach, evening walks when weather permitted, shared meals when Yates could afford to contribute. Mrs. Chen watched them with knowing eyes and said nothing, but her smile suggested she approved. The more time Yates spent with Rosalie, the more he marveled at her ability to understand him. It went beyond reading his expressions. She seemed to anticipate his thoughts, finishing his sentences before he could write them, knowing when he needed silence and when he needed distraction. She told him once that she had always been observant, but with him, it felt like something more, an almost uncanny connection. "It is like learning a new language," she explained one evening in Mrs. Chen's kitchen. They were helping prepare dinner, Yates chopping vegetables while Rosalie rolled out dough. "At first I had to think about what your expressions meant. Now I just know. Your eyes say so much, Yates, more than some people say with 1,000 words." He paused his chopping to write, "I wish I could talk to you properly, tell you things." "You do tell me things," Rosalie said. She wiped flour from her hands and came to stand beside him. "Look at me." He did, confused. She smiled gently. "Right now you are thinking that you want to tell me something important, but you are afraid," she said. "You are worried that you are not good enough, that you don't have enough to offer, and you wish more than anything that you could speak so you could say what you are feeling properly." Yates felt his breath catch. She had read him perfectly, seen straight into his heart. "Am I right?" Rosalie asked softly. He nodded slowly. "Then let me tell you what I see when I look at you," she continued. "I see a man who is kind and brave and thoughtful. A man who saved horses from a burning barn even though it cost him his voice. A man who helped a stranger find safe lodging when he had no reason to. A man who works hard every day and never complains about the difficulties he faces." She paused. Her eyes locked on his. "I see a man I have come to care about deeply." Yates's hands trembled as he reached for his notebook. He wrote 2 words, "I care too." It was inadequate, pale compared to what he felt, but Rosalie's face lit up as if he had written poetry. "I know," she whispered. "I can see it every time you look at me." He set down the notebook and, moving slowly to give her time to step away, reached out to cup her face gently with one calloused hand. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. When she opened them again, the question in her gaze was clear. Yates leaned down and kissed her, gentle and tentative. Rosalie responded immediately, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. The kiss deepened, and Yates felt years of loneliness and fear melt away, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove heating Mrs. Chen's kitchen. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rosalie laughed softly. "Well," she said, "that was worth waiting for." He grinned, and she laughed again at his expression. "You look very pleased with yourself." He reached for his notebook. "Very pleased." Mrs. Chen chose that moment to return from the market, took one look at their flushed faces and knowing expressions, and simply smiled. "About time," she said in her accented English. "I have been waiting for you two to figure it out." Over the following weeks, Yates and Rosalie navigated this new development in their relationship with a mixture of excitement and caution. Nome was not a town that looked kindly on scandalous behavior, and Rosalie's reputation as a teacher needed to be maintained. They were discreet in public, but in private moments they grew closer. Rosalie continued to amaze him with her ability to understand his thoughts. One afternoon, they were sitting in her small room, the stove keeping them warm against the October cold. Yates was helping her grade papers while she prepared the next week's lessons. He looked up from a student's arithmetic and found her watching him. "You're thinking about the future," she said quietly. He nodded slowly. It was true. He had been wondering what future they could possibly have together. "You are wondering if we can make this work," Rosalie continued. "If a relationship can succeed when one person cannot speak. If I will eventually grow tired of reading your expressions and writing." She paused. "You are afraid," he wrote carefully. "Are those fears unreasonable?" "Perhaps a little," Rosalie admitted, "but I understand them." She set down her pen and came to sit beside him. "Yates, do you remember what I said about learning to read you like a language? It is not a burden. It is actually rather wonderful. I feel like I know you better than I have ever known anyone because I have to pay attention to everything. Your eyes, your gestures, the way you hold yourself. Most people half listen when someone speaks. I have to fully listen to you with all my senses. It makes our connection deeper, not shallower." He wanted to believe her. He wrote, "What about the practical things? I cannot call for help if you need it. I cannot speak to customers if we need money. I cannot defend you with words." "You can defend me with actions," Rosalie said firmly. "And as for the rest, we will find ways to manage. We already do, don't we? You communicate quite well when you need to." "What will people say?" he wrote. "People always talk," Rosalie said. "They talked when I came to Nome alone. They talked when I took a teaching position. They will talk if we court seriously, and they will talk if we marry. I stopped caring about gossip a long time ago." The word marry made his heart race. He wrote, "You would marry me?" "If you asked me properly, I might say yes," Rosalie said. Her eyes twinkling with amusement and affection. He stared at her, his mind racing. They had known each other less than 2 months. It was too soon, surely. But frontier life moved quickly, and winter was settling in around them. By the time spring came, anything could happen. People could leave or die or simply change their minds. If he waited, he might lose her. He stood abruptly and pulled her to her feet. Rosalie looked surprised but let him position her in front of him. Then, moving deliberately, he dropped to one knee. "Yates!" Rosalie breathed, her hands flying to her mouth. He pulled out his notebook and wrote quickly, his handwriting messier than usual. "I have nothing to offer but hard work and a damaged voice, but I love you with everything I am. Will you marry me?" Rosalie's eyes filled with tears. She read the words once, then again, then dropped to her knees in front of him so they were eye level. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I will marry you. He kissed her then, pulling her close, feeling her tears on his face mixing with his own. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at once, Rosalie pressed her forehead to his. You do have things to offer, she whispered. You have kindness and strength and love. That is everything, Yates, everything that matters. He held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her in his arms. For the first time since the fire, since leaving Missouri, since his whole difficult life, he felt like he had found a home. They told Mrs. Chen that evening, and the older woman's face crinkled with joy. I am very happy for you both, she said, hugging Rosalie tightly. You are good together. I could see it from the beginning. We want to marry soon, Rosalie said, before the winter gets too harsh. Is that foolish? Not foolish, Mrs. Chen said. Practical. Winter in Nome is long and dark. Better to face it together. They set a date for late October, just 2 weeks away. There was no time for elaborate preparations, but neither of them wanted elaborate anyway. Rosalie wrote to her brother Robert, who was pleased, and promised to come to town for the ceremony. Yates had no family to invite, which Rosalie understood without him having to explain. The days before the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Rosalie arranged for the ceremony to be held in the small church that served Nome's diverse population. Mrs. Chen helped her sew a simple but beautiful dress from fabric she had been saving. Yates used his savings to buy a plain gold ring from one of the jewelers who catered to newly wealthy prospectors. The night before the wedding, Yates lay awake in his small room staring at the ceiling. He was happy, happier than he had ever thought possible, but fear still gnawed at him. What if his father somehow found him? What if Rosalie realized she had made a mistake? What if he couldn't be the husband she deserved? As if summoned by his thoughts, there was a soft knock on his door. He opened it to find Rosalie standing there, wrapped in a thick shawl against the cold. I know it is bad luck to see each other before the wedding, she said, but I had the feeling you were worrying, and I wanted to check on you. He gestured her inside, closing the door against the frigid October night. She sat on his narrow bed, the only furniture in the room besides a small table and chair. Talk to me, she said gently. What are you thinking? He wrote, Afraid I will fail you. Rosalie took the notebook from his hands and set it aside. Then she took both his hands in hers. Look at me, Yates. He did, and her gray-blue eyes were steady and sure. You will not fail me, she said firmly. We will face difficulties, certainly. Life is difficult, but we will face them together. You are stronger than you think, and we are stronger together than apart. I believe that with my whole heart. He squeezed her hands tightly, trying to convey through touch what he couldn't say with words. Tomorrow we start a new life, Rosalie continued. Not your life or my life, but our life. Whatever comes, we will handle it. Do you trust me? He nodded emphatically. Then trust me when I say that marrying you is the best decision I have ever made. She smiled. Now try to get some sleep. We have a wedding to attend tomorrow. She kissed him softly and left, and Yates lay back down feeling calmer. Whatever fears he had, they were outweighed by the certainty that Rosalie was right. Together they could handle anything. The wedding day dawned cold and clear, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed almost unreal after so many gray days. Yates dressed in his best clothes, which weren't much but were clean and carefully maintained. His hands shook slightly as he tried to button his shirt, and he had to start over twice before getting it right. The church was small but warm, heated by a large iron stove. A handful of people had gathered: Mrs. Chen, Rosalie's brother Robert, a few of Rosalie's students and their parents, and some of the people Yates had worked with. The minister, a weathered man named Reverend Walsh, greeted him with a kind smile. I understand you cannot speak your vows, Reverend Walsh said. Mrs. Chen explained your situation. We have made accommodations. You will be able to nod your agreement, and that will be sufficient in the eyes of God and the law. Yates nodded gratefully. Then the doors opened and Rosalie entered. She was beautiful. The dress Mrs. Chen had made was simple, a pale blue that complemented her eyes, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was pinned up with small white flowers that Mrs. Chen had somehow preserved from the brief summer. But more than her appearance, it was the expression on her face that took Yates's breath away. She was radiant with happiness, looking at him like he was everything she had ever wanted. Her brother Robert, a tall young man with Rosalie's coloring, walked her down the short aisle. When he placed her hand in Yates's, he whispered, "Take care of her." Yates nodded solemnly. He would take care of her. He would do everything in his power to make her happy. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Reverend Walsh spoke about love and commitment, about partnership and faith. When it came time for vows, he addressed Yates first. "Yates Hartwell, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Yates looked into Rosalie's eyes and nodded firmly. Yes, yes to all of it. Reverend Walsh turned to Rosalie. "Rosalie Lawson, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" "I do," Rosalie said clearly, her voice steady. "With all my heart." "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Walsh said. "You may kiss your bride." Yates pulled Rosalie close and kissed her, hearing the small congregation applaud and cheer. When they broke apart, both smiling widely, he felt like his heart might burst from happiness. This woman, this incredible, brave, perceptive woman, was his wife. They signed the marriage certificate, Yates's signature neat and careful, next to Rosalie's flowing script. Mrs. Chen had arranged a small celebration at her house, with food and even some precious whiskey that someone had brought. It was modest by most standards, but it felt perfect to Yates. Rosalie laughed and talked with their guests, and whenever she looked at him, her face glowed with happiness. Robert pulled Yates aside at one point. "I want you to know that I approve," the younger man said seriously. "When Rosalie wrote that she was marrying someone she had known less than 2 months, I was worried. But I can see how she looks at you and how you look at her. You are good for each other." Yates pulled out his notebook. "I will take care of her, I promise." "I believe you," Robert said. He clapped Yates on the shoulder. "Welcome to the family, such as it is." As the celebration wound down and guests departed, Mrs. Chen pulled Yates and Rosalie aside. "I have a wedding gift for you," she said. She led them to a small building behind her house, a structure Yates had seen before but never entered. "My husband built this planning to expand the laundry business. He died before he could finish it. I've been using it for storage, but I want you to have it." She opened the door to reveal a single large room, rough but solid, with a small stove and 2 windows. "It needs work," Mrs. Chen admitted, "but it is yours if you want it. You can make it a home." Rosalie's eyes widened. "Mrs. Chen, this is too generous." "Nonsense," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You are both good people. You helped me when you first arrived, Rosalie, keeping me company and helping with the laundry, and Yates has repaired my roof and stove many times without asking for payment. Let me help you now. Consider it rent paid in advance." Yates wrote quickly, "We accept. Thank you." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Good, now go. Enjoy your wedding night. We will talk about fixing up the place tomorrow." That night, in Rosalie's small room that would now be shared, Yates held his wife close and marveled at the turn his life had taken. Just months ago, he had been voiceless and alone, convinced he had nothing to offer anyone. Now he had a wife who loved him, a place to call home, and a future that looked bright despite the long, dark winter ahead. Rosalie traced patterns on his chest lazily, her head resting on his shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. He nodded against her hair. then reached for the notebook he had left on the bedside table. More than I thought possible. Good, Rosalie murmured. Me too. They fell asleep, tangled together, warm and content, while outside the first snow of winter began to fall. The months that followed were both challenging and rewarding. Yates and Rosalie threw themselves into fixing up the building Mrs. Chen had given them. It was hard work, especially as winter closed in fully and temperatures plummeted, but working side by side, they transformed the rough space into a cozy home. Yates built furniture from scrap lumber, crafting a bed frame, a table, and chairs. Rosalie sewed curtains and cushions from fabric she traded for with some of her teacher's salary. Mrs. Chen contributed a spare rug and some kitchen supplies. By December, their little house felt warm and lived in, a haven against the brutal Alaskan winter. The long darkness of winter in Nome was difficult for everyone, but Yates and Rosalie found ways to make it bearable. Rosalie continued teaching, though the schoolhouse was often bitterly cold, despite the stove burning constantly. Yates found work wherever he could, mostly indoor jobs now that outdoor labor was nearly impossible. He helped repair equipment, worked in the few warehouses that stayed operational, and even assisted Mrs. Chen with her laundry business when it got busy. What sustained them both was coming home each evening to their small house, lighting lamps against the darkness, cooking simple meals together and talking. Or rather, Rosalie talked while Yates communicated through his notebook and the increasingly complex system of expressions and gestures they had developed. Their ability to understand each other deepened with each passing day. Rosalie could now interpret meaning from the slightest movement of his eyebrows or the angle of his head. It was, as she had said, like a language all their own. "You are thinking that we need more firewood," she said one January evening, looking up from the sewing she was working on. Yates, who had indeed been calculating their wood supply in his head, nodded and wrote, "How do you always know?" "You got that focused look you get when you are planning something practical," Rosalie explained, "and you glanced at the woodpile twice. It was not hard to deduce." She set down her sewing. "I can go with you tomorrow to gather more." He shook his head firmly. It was too cold, and the wind had been brutal lately. He wrote, "Too dangerous." "Yates, I am not fragile," Rosalie said with a touch of exasperation. "I can handle cold weather." "I know," he wrote, "but I would worry. Let me do it." She sighed but smiled. "Fine. But if you're not back by noon, I'm coming to find you." He leaned over and kissed her forehead, knowing better than to argue further. Rosalie's stubborn streak was one of the things he loved about her, even when it frustrated him. As winter wore on, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Life in Nome during the dark months required resilience and adaptation, but they faced it together. Rosalie shared stories about her students, and Yates learned through her eyes about the diverse community of children being educated in that small schoolhouse. There were the sons and daughters of miners, the children of merchants, and Inupiat children whose families had lived in the area for generations. Rosalie treated them all equally, which earned her respect from families across the social spectrum. One evening in February, Rosalie came home from school looking thoughtful. "One of my students, a girl named Anna, has parents who are deaf," she said as they prepared dinner. "The family uses hand signs to communicate. It made me think of us." Yates looked up from chopping vegetables, curious. "Anna has been teaching me some of the signs," Rosalie continued. "I was thinking perhaps we could develop our own signs, things that are faster than you writing everything down. We already use some gestures, but we could make it more systematic." It was an intriguing idea. Yates had seen people use hand signals before, but had never considered it as a comprehensive communication method. He wrote, "Show me what you learned." Over the following weeks, they worked on developing their own system of signs. Some were borrowed from what Rosalie learned from Anna's family, and some they created themselves. A particular gesture meant yes or no. Another meant hungry or tired. They developed signs for common questions and responses, for emotions and needs. It was imperfect and limited, but it added another layer to their communication. The process of creating this shared language brought them even closer. They spent evenings practicing, laughing when they misunderstood each other, celebrating when a new sign clicked into place. Yates found himself able to express things more quickly, and Rosalie enjoyed the playfulness of their expanding vocabulary. "You were getting quite good at this," she said one night, after he had managed to convey an entire story about his day using signs and minimal writing. "Soon you will be chattering away at me with your hands." He grinned and signed what had become their private sign for "I love you," a gesture they had created together. It was a simple movement, but it carried weight and meaning. Rosalie repeated the sign back to him, her eyes soft. "I love you too." As February turned to March, the days slowly began to lengthen. The sun stayed above the horizon longer, and while it was still brutally cold, there was a sense that winter's grip was starting to loosen. Rosalie began talking about the spring with anticipation, planning a small garden they could plant once the ground thawed. "Fresh vegetables would be wonderful," she said dreamily. "I am so tired of dried beans and tinned goods." Yates was sketching plans for expanding their house, thinking about adding another room. He showed his drawings to Rosalie, who studied them carefully. "You are thinking we will need more space?" she asked. He nodded. They had been married nearly 5 months now, and while they were happy in their small home, he was thinking about the future. He wrote, "A family needs room." Rosalie's expression shifted to something tender. "Are you saying you want children?" He nodded again, watching her face carefully. They hadn't discussed this explicitly, but he had assumed they both wanted a family eventually. "I want that too," Rosalie said softly. "I want to build a life here with you, Yates. A real, lasting life." He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. He wanted that too, more than he could express even with their expanded communication. A life in Nome, raising children, growing old together. It seemed almost too good to be true. That night as they lay in bed, Rosalie was unusually quiet. Yates touched her arm questioningly. "I am just thinking," she said, "about how strange life is. A year ago, I was teaching in Seattle, living a perfectly ordinary life. I never imagined I would end up here, married to a man I barely knew 2 months before our wedding." She turned to look at him in the dim lamplight. "But I would not change anything. This is where I'm supposed to be." He reached for his notebook on the bedside table. "Fate? Maybe," Rosalie said. "Or maybe we just recognized something in each other. A connection that was worth pursuing, even if it seemed impractical or rushed." She smiled. "Either way, I am grateful." He set the notebook aside and kissed her, trying to pour everything he felt into the gesture. When they broke apart, she was smiling, and he knew she had understood. Spring came slowly to Nome, but it did come. By April, the sea ice was breaking up, and the first ships began arriving with supplies and new waves of prospectors. The town exploded with activity after the quiet winter months. Rosalie finished the school year, proud of her students' progress. Yates found more consistent work as construction projects resumed. In May, Rosalie discovered she was pregnant. She told Yates one evening after he came home from work, her face glowing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Are you happy?" she asked, watching his reaction closely. Yates felt like his heart might explode. He nodded vigorously and pulled her into his arms, holding her gently but tightly. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet with tears. "Those are happy tears, I hope," Rosalie said, laughing a little. He nodded again and grabbed his notebook. "Very happy, are you?" "Terrified," Rosalie admitted. "But yes, very happy. We are going to be parents, Yates." The news changed everything and nothing. They continued their routines, but now with an eye toward preparing for a baby. Yates worked on expanding their house, adding a second room that would serve as a nursery. Rosalie began sewing baby clothes with Mrs. Chen's help. Robert visited when he could, excited about becoming an uncle. As Rosalie's pregnancy progressed through the summer months, Yates found himself simultaneously elated and anxious. He worried constantly about her health, about the challenges of childbirth in a frontier town, about whether he would be a good father despite his inability to speak. Rosalie, ever perceptive, addressed his fears one evening as they sat watching the midnight sun. "You are worried about the baby," she said. It wasn't a question. He wrote, "What if I cannot communicate with our child? What if they need help and I cannot call for it?" "Yates, you communicate just fine," Rosalie said firmly. "Our child will grow up understanding that their father expresses himself differently. They will learn to read your expressions just like I do. And as for calling for help, we will find solutions. We always do." "What if something happens to you?" he wrote, the words shaky. "During childbirth?" Rosalie took his hand. "Dr. Perkins is experienced, and Mrs. Chen has helped deliver babies before. I will be fine. We will both be fine." He wanted to believe her. He did believe her mostly, but the fear lingered, a constant shadow on his happiness. The summer passed quickly. Rosalie continued teaching until the heat made it too uncomfortable. She spent her days preparing their home for the baby while Yates worked and built. They had never been happier, despite the underlying anxiety about the birth. In late September, as the days began to shorten again and autumn settled over Nome, Rosalie went into labor. Mrs. Chen immediately took charge, sending for Dr. Perkins and boiling water while Yates stood by feeling helpless. The labor was long and difficult. Yates paced outside their house for hours, unable to bear watching Rosalie in pain, but unable to leave either. When he finally heard the cry of a baby, he rushed inside to find Dr. Perkins holding a small, red-faced infant. "You have a son," the doctor said, smiling, "and a healthy boy." Rosalie lay exhausted on their bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but she was smiling. "Come see him," she said weakly. Yates approached slowly, almost afraid. Dr. Perkins placed the baby in his arms carefully. The infant was tiny, impossibly small, with a scrunched face and waving fists. Yates looked down at his son and felt his heart completely reorganize itself around this new person. "He is perfect," Rosalie whispered, "just like his father." Yates couldn't write with his hands full, so he just looked at her, hoping his expression conveyed everything he felt. From her soft smile, he thought maybe it did. They named the baby Samuel, after Rosalie's father. Samuel was a demanding infant, waking multiple times each night and requiring constant attention. Yates had worried about not being able to comfort a crying baby, but he discovered that infants didn't need words. They needed warmth and food and love. He could provide 2 of those 3, and Rosalie handled the feeding. The first time Samuel quieted in his arms, Yates felt a surge of relief and joy. He could do this. He could be a father. As Samuel grew from a newborn to an infant to a toddler, Yates's earlier fears proved largely unfounded. Samuel learned early that his father didn't speak, but it didn't seem to confuse or upset him. As soon as he could focus his eyes properly, he watched Yates's face intently, learning to read expressions just as Rosalie had. By the time Samuel was learning to talk, he understood that his father communicated differently, and he accepted it as normal. "Papa," Samuel would say, pointing at Yates and grinning. His first words were "Mama" and "Papa," and even though Yates couldn't respond verbally, the sound of his son calling him Papa made his chest tight with emotion. Life settled into a new rhythm. Rosalie returned to teaching when Samuel was old enough, and Mrs. Chen happily watched the boy during the day. Yates continued working, now with the added responsibility of providing for a family. It was hard work, especially during the long winters, but it was also deeply satisfying. Samuel grew into a bright, curious child. By age 3, he was already learning to read, encouraged by Rosalie's teacher instincts. He also developed his own signs to communicate with Yates, mixing the system his parents had created with his own inventive gestures. Watching his son chatter away in a combination of words and signs never failed to make Yates smile. One evening, when Samuel was 4 years old, the boy asked a question that Rosalie had been expecting, but that still made her heart clench. "Mama, why doesn't Papa talk?" They were sitting at dinner, and Yates froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Rosalie met his eyes, and he could see her thinking through how to answer. Papa was hurt in a fire, Rosalie explained gently. It damaged his throat, so he cannot make the sounds for talking, but he can still communicate. He uses his hands and his face and writing. You have always known that. But why did he go into the fire? Samuel asked. Rosalie smiled. Because he was saving horses. Papa is very brave. He rescued animals even though it was dangerous. Samuel looked at Yates with wide eyes. You saved horses? Yates nodded and made the sign for yes. That is very brave, Samuel said seriously. Then he climbed out of his chair and hugged Yates's leg. I am glad you saved the horses, Papa, even if it means you cannot talk. Yates picked up his son and held him close, overwhelmed with love for this small person who accepted him so completely. That night, after Samuel was asleep, Rosalie curled up against Yates on their bed. You handled that well, she said. He wrote, You handled it. You always know what to say. We make a good team, Rosalie said. We always have. He agreed completely. They had built a good life together, against the odds and despite the challenges. Nome had become home in a way nowhere else ever had. He had a wife he adored, a son he loved beyond measure, and a community that had accepted them. The years passed, each bringing its own joys and challenges. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved learning and exploring. Rosalie continued teaching, becoming one of the most respected educators in Nome. Yates's work expanded as his reputation for being reliable and skilled grew. They added another room to their house when Rosalie became pregnant again, welcoming a daughter they named Clara when Samuel was 6. Clara was different from Samuel, quieter and more observant. From infancy, she watched her father with intense focus, and Rosalie joked that Clara had inherited her mother's talent for reading people. As she grew, Clara became almost eerily good at understanding what Yates was thinking, sometimes even better than Rosalie. Papa thinks we should go to the beach tomorrow, Clara announced one evening when she was 4, having apparently read this intention from Yates's glance out the window at the clear weather. Rosalie laughed. Is that so? Yates? Is Clara right? He nodded, amazed as always by his daughter's perceptiveness. He signed yes and then the sign for smart girl, which made Clara beam with pride. With 2 children, life was busier but also richer. Samuel and Clara adored each other, despite the age difference, and they both adapted seamlessly to having a father who communicated differently. They told their friends matter-of-factly that their papa couldn't talk, but could say everything he needed to with his hands and eyes. Most of the other children in Nome accepted this without question, and those who didn't were quickly corrected by Samuel's fierce loyalty. My papa is the best, Samuel would declare hotly to anyone who suggested otherwise. He can do anything except talk, and he doesn't need to talk because we understand him. Yates couldn't have asked for better advocates than his own children. As the children grew older, Yates and Rosalie's relationship deepened and matured. They had weathered the intense early days of new love, the adjustment of marriage, the challenges of pregnancy and parenthood. Now, after more than a decade together, they had a partnership built on deep understanding and unwavering support. Rosalie still read his thoughts with uncanny accuracy, often knowing what he needed before he did. And Yates had learned to read her just as well, anticipating her moods and needs. They communicated less through his notebook now and more through their private language of signs, expressions, and that indefinable connection that seemed to run deeper than words. Do you ever miss talking? Rosalie asked him one night. The children were asleep and they were sitting by their stove, enjoying a rare, quiet moment. Really miss it? Yates considered the question. There were times when the inability to speak frustrated him, certainly. Times when writing felt too slow or when he wanted to call out to his children playing in the distance. But miss it? He wrote, sometimes. But I gained more than I lost. How so? Rosalie asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. I learned to listen better, to observe, to communicate more deeply than words allow, he wrote, and I found you. I don't think we would have connected the same way if I could speak. Rosalie's eyes grew bright with tears. That is beautiful, Yates, and probably true. I had to learn to really see you, and that changed how I see everything. She took his hand. You made me a better person. He leaned over and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that communicated better than any words or writing. When they broke apart, she was smiling. I love you, she said, more every day. He signed their private gesture for I love you, and she repeated it back, and in that moment everything was perfect. The years continued to pass. Samuel grew into a thoughtful teenager with his mother's intelligence and his father's quiet strength. He talked about becoming a teacher like his mother, or perhaps a doctor. Clara, now 10, remained observant and intuitive, displaying artistic talents that delighted both her parents. She could draw her father's expressions with uncanny accuracy, capturing emotions that she read from his eyes. Nome changed around them too. The gold rush slowed, but the town remained, becoming more permanent and less transient. Buildings that had been rough and temporary were replaced with solid structures. The school where Rosalie taught expanded. Life became less about survival and more about community. Yates and Rosalie were respected members of that community. Rosalie's years of dedicated teaching had earned her admiration, and Yates's reliability and skill had made him someone people sought out for important work. The fact that he couldn't speak was barely noticed anymore by people who knew them. It was just part of who Yates was, like his height or his dark hair graying at the temples. One autumn evening, when Samuel was 16 and Clara was 10, Robert visited from his claim. He had done well over the years, finding enough gold to be comfortable but not wealthy. He still worked his claim but came to town regularly to see his sister and her family. You have built something remarkable here, Robert told Yates, as they sat on the porch of the now expanded house, watching the children play in the yard. A real family, a real home. I envy you sometimes. Yates pulled out his notebook, which he still carried, though he used it less frequently now. You could have the same. Find someone, settle down. Robert laughed. Maybe someday. But I have always been too restless. Rosalie got the settling down gene in our family. He paused. She is happy, you know. Truly happy. I can see it every time I visit. I know, Yates wrote. I am too. She told me once that meeting you was like finding the missing piece of herself, Robert continued. That she didn't know she was incomplete until she met you, and then suddenly everything made sense. I think that is what real love is supposed to be like. Yates felt his throat tighten with emotion. He couldn't respond verbally, but he hoped his expression conveyed his gratitude for Robert's words. That night, after the children were asleep and Robert had retired to the guest room they had added years ago, Yates and Rosalie lay in bed talking quietly. Robert said you told him I was the missing piece of yourself we success for. Yates wrote. Rosalie smiled. He told you that? I did say something like that. It is true. Before I met you, I always felt like I was looking for something but didn't know what. Then there you were. This silent, sad man who saved horses from a fire. And somehow I knew immediately that you were important. I felt the same, he wrote. When I saw you on the dock that first day, you looked at me like I was a person, not a problem. No one had looked at me like that since the fire. We saw each other, Rosalie said softly. Really saw. That is rare. He set down his notebook and pulled her close. She nestled against his chest, and he breathed in the familiar scent of her hair. They had grown older together, faced challenges together, built a life together, and he wouldn't change a single moment of it. Yates, Rosalie murmured sleepily. Are you happy? He squeezed her gently, their signal for yes, when he couldn't reach his notebook, or his hands weren't free for signing. Good, she whispered. Me too. The years continued their steady march. Samuel eventually went to Seattle for further education, wanting to become a doctor. It was hard to let him go, but Yates and Rosalie were proud of their son's ambition and determination. Samuel promised to return to Nome eventually to bring modern medicine to the frontier town that had raised him. Clara, meanwhile, blossomed into a talented artist. She painted scenes of Alaska, capturing the dramatic landscapes and the hardy people who lived there. Rosalie encouraged her talent, and Yates built her a small studio where she could work in good light. When Clara was 16, she began seriously courting a young man named Thomas, the son of a merchant family. Yates watched carefully, protective of his daughter, but also remembering how young he and Rosalie had been when they married. When Thomas asked for permission to court Clara properly, he came to Yates first, showing respect that Yates appreciated. "I care deeply for Clara, sir," Thomas said nervously. "I know I am young, but my intentions are honorable. I want to build a life here in Nome, and I want Clara to be part of that life." Yates studied the young man carefully. Thomas met his gaze steadily despite his obvious nerves. Yates pulled out his notebook. "Do you love her?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said immediately. "Very much." "Does she love you?" "She says she does," Thomas replied, "and I believe her." Yates wrote, "Then you have my permission to court her properly, but hurt her and you will answer to me." Thomas smiled with relief. "Thank you, sir. I promise. I will take good care of her." Watching his daughter fall in love reminded Yates of those early days with Rosalie. The excitement, the uncertainty, the sense of everything changing. Clara glowed with happiness when she was with Thomas, and Yates found himself hoping they would have the same kind of deep connection he shared with Rosalie. "You were thinking about us when we were young," Rosalie said one evening, watching Yates watch Clara and Thomas sitting on the porch talking. He nodded and wrote, "Hard to believe Clara is the age you were when we married." "Time moves so quickly," Rosalie agreed. "It feels like yesterday that we were standing in that little church promising our lives to each other, and now look at us. Gray hair, laugh lines, and 2 grown children." "No regrets?" he wrote. "Not a single one," Rosalie said firmly. "You?" He shook his head emphatically. Then he wrote, "Best decision I ever made was going into Mrs. Chen's market that day and helping you find a room. Best decision I ever made was trusting the kind-eyed man who offered to help a stranger," Rosalie replied. She took his hand. "We have had a good life, Yates, a really good life." He squeezed her hand in agreement. They had. Against all odds, despite all challenges, they had built something beautiful together. Clara and Thomas married when she was 18, a small but joyful ceremony that reminded everyone of Yates and Rosalie's wedding years before. Samuel returned from Seattle for the wedding, now a confident young man studying medicine. The house felt full and warm with family gathered, and Yates thought about how much had changed since that terrifying night when he had plunged into a burning barn. He had lost his voice but found everything else that mattered. A wife who understood him better than words could express, children who loved him completely, a home, a community, a life rich with meaning and connection. After the wedding, as Clara and Thomas prepared to move into their own small house that Yates had helped build, Rosalie found him standing in their yard, looking at the home they had expanded and improved over the years. "What are you thinking?" she asked, slipping her arm through his. He pulled out his notebook, though he suspected she already knew, thinking about how blessed I am, how lucky we are. "Luck has nothing to do with it," Rosalie said. "We built this together. Through hard work and love and determination, we made our own luck." He smiled at her, and she smiled back, and in that moment, he felt the same connection they had shared from the very beginning. That sense of being completely understood, completely accepted, completely loved. The sun was setting over Nome, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The Bering Sea stretched out beyond the town, endless and powerful. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear children playing and dogs barking and the general noise of a town settling in for the evening. "Come inside," Rosalie said. "I will make tea and we can sit by the fire. We can plan our garden for next spring. We can talk about Samuel's letters and Clara's new life. We can just be together." He nodded and followed her inside, to the home they had made, to the life they had built. As he closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold evening air, he thought about how the young man who had lost his voice in that barn fire could never have imagined this future. But Rosalie had seen it somehow from that very first day. She had looked into his eyes and read his heart and decided he was worth taking a chance on. And every day since, she had continued reading him, understanding him, loving him in ways that went deeper than any words could reach. That night, as they sat by the fire with tea growing cold in their cups, Rosalie leaned her head on his shoulder. "Tell me a story," she said. It was their old game. She would ask him to tell a story, and he would write it out or use their signs, and she would interpret and elaborate, turning his simple communications into rich narratives. They had played this game for years, and it never got old. He thought for a moment, then began signing. He told her about a young man who made a terrible mistake in Missouri and spent years running, about how he came north seeking escape and found only more emptiness, about a barn fire that took his voice but saved 5 horses, about standing on a dock one August day and seeing a woman with gray-blue eyes who looked at him like he mattered. Rosalie watched his hands move, his face express emotions, and she nodded as she followed along. When he finished, she continued the story. "And that woman looked at the man and saw not what he had lost but what he had to offer," she said softly. She saw kindness and strength and courage. She saw someone who would build her a home and give her children and love her through dark winters and bright summers. She saw her future, and she reached out and took it. He signed their private gesture for "I love you." She repeated it back. "Always," she whispered, "for always." The fire crackled, the tea grew colder, and outside the wind began to pick up, promising another long Alaska winter. But inside, Yates and Rosalie were warm and together and complete. They had weathered so much and would weather more, but as long as they had each other, as long as she could read his eyes and answer every thought, they would be fine. More than fine. They would be happy. And that, Yates thought as he held his wife close, was more than he had ever dared to hope for when he had stumbled out of that burning barn, gasping and voiceless, into an uncertain future. He had lost his voice, but found his voice in different ways. Through Rosalie's understanding, through his children's acceptance, through the life they had built together, he had learned that communication was about more than words. It was about connection, about being truly seen and truly known. And in that regard, he communicated better now than he ever had when he could speak. The years ahead would bring more changes. Samuel would return as a doctor and open a practice in Nome. Clara and Thomas would have children, making Yates and Rosalie grandparents. Mrs. Chen would pass away peacefully in her sleep, leaving her property to the couple who had become like family to her. The town would continue growing and changing, becoming more civilized and less wild. Through it all, Yates and Rosalie would remain constants in each other's lives. They would grow old together, their hair turning white, their movements slower, but their connection as strong as ever. She would continue reading his eyes, answering his thoughts, understanding him in ways that transcended language. And when people asked Rosalie how she managed being married to a man who couldn't speak, she would smile and say, "He tells me everything I need to know. You just have to know how to listen." Because that was the truth at the heart of their story. Love wasn't about perfect circumstances or easy paths. It was about choosing to see each other, to understand each other, to build something together, even when the odds seemed impossible. Yates had walked into that barn fire a lonely, frightened man running from his past. He had walked out voiceless, but would eventually walk into a future brighter than anything he could have imagined. Not because his circumstances magically improved, but because he found someone who saw past the loss to the person underneath. And Rosalie had come to Nome seeking adventure and found something far more precious. A love that didn't need words, a connection that went soul deep, a partnership that would sustain her through every challenge life threw at them. They had found each other in the most unlikely of places, under the most unlikely of circumstances, but once found, they held on tight and never let go. As the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, Yates pulled Rosalie closer. She sighed contentedly, her hand finding his and lacing their fingers together. "Happy?" she murmured, half asleep. He squeezed her hand. Yes, always yes. And that was everything.